Right.
So do you want me to introduce you?
3,
or will you continue?
2, 1. Go ahead.
Good morning and a warm welcome to members of the media and our viewing public. Thank you for joining with us. I am Kavita Sukram, Corporate Communications Officer at the Ministry of Finance. Today, the Honourable Colm Imbert, Minister of Finance, will be providing an update on finance matters and the COVID-19 relief programs. We will be taking questions from the media later on. So for now, without further ado, I will now pass you over to the Honourable Colm Imbert, Minister of Finance.
Good morning. The purpose of this press conference is to deal with some issues that I was not able to deal with during the recent debate on the supplementation of appropriation because of limitations of time. There are particular restrictions on time with the COVID-19. As a result, we just get about 40 minutes. If you would think back, the budget statement is usually for at least 3 hours. And that is more than enough time to give a broad overview of the financial situation and the performance of the economy and so on. But in the 40 minutes that was allotted, both in the House of Representatives and the Senate, there just wasn't sufficient time to deal with a lot of fiscal and monetary matters because we were dealing with supplementations to various heads of expenditure, various line items for various ministries and so on. And that was the important thing at the time. So I thought I would have this press conference just to put things into perspective. Let me report now on central government fiscal operations. I would have said some of these things during the debate, but I simply did not have the kind of time I would have liked. For the period October 1st, 2020 to April 30th, 2021, that is the information we have so far. We would have revenue figures for May, but we would not have expenditure figures yet. So for that period, October to April, which is a period of 7 months, the forecast for revenue was 22,956,000,000. That was the projected amount. Almost $23 billion for the first 7 months of the year. The actual amount collected was 20.45 billion. So our receipts were up 2,505,000,000 less than we had projected. The negative variance was due to lower than anticipated receipts from taxes on incomes and profits, non-tax revenue, I'll explain what that is in a minute, capital revenue, and items such as the unemployment fund and the green fund. This was offset to some extent by higher than projected receipts on taxes on goods and services, which is mainly value added tax, and taxes on international trade, which is customs duty. The lower than projected performance of taxes on incomes and profits was primarily due to lower taxes from oil companies, where oil and gas companies, the fall off or shortfall in revenue was $409 million during that 7-month period. For other companies, it was 119. So the shortfall under other companies, which is non-oil sector, all of the various industries that we know, manufacturing, retail, construction, and even the petrochemical sector is lumped into the other companies. The shortfall was just 119 million. The shortfall from individuals was very little, almost, we collected almost what we had projected, just a $28 million shortfall there. There was a shortfall on withholding tax, which is directly attributed to the shortfall in the energy sector. respect to non-tax revenue, and this is where there's a significant fall off. Non-tax revenue is where royalties on oil and gas are counted. And if I look at non-tax revenue, the projection was based on projected production of 3.2 billion standard cubic feet of gas per day and gas price of about $3 per MMBTU, $3 US. The royalty would have been, if we achieved those levels, approximately 2.9 billion, 2,911 million. That was the projection for royalties. We, in fact, only collected 1 billion. So there was a significant shortfall there because of lower than estimated production of gas and significantly lower prices of gas than anticipated. So there was a shortfall there of $1.8 billion. There was also a shortfall in what we call extraordinary revenue from oil and gas companies, where as a result of certain negotiations, there's a formula where the government is to receive significant sums of money, up to $1 billion a year if prices are good. But unfortunately, because prices were significantly below estimates for gas in particular, we were not able to realize the extraordinary revenue, and that was a shortfall there of $330 million. As I said, when you look at the other areas, if I look at individuals, for example, we had calculated that we would receive $3,505 million in individual income tax, 3.505, and we got 3,477, so we did quite well there. In terms of taxes from other companies, we had expected to get 3,147 million, and we got 3,028 million there. So that the other sectors of the economy appear to be holding their own. In terms of expenditure, we were able to contain expenditure because of decreased revenue. We throttled back a bit on expenditure. The projected expenditure for that period, October to April, was 29.2 billion, and the actual amount spent was 25.6 billion. So we were able to spend $3.6 billion lower than the projected level. Quite a lot of this had to do with COVID as well, in terms of spending on the public sector investment program because of restrictions that restricted construction activity and so on. So when you look at the outturn, the expenditure at the end of April was projected to be 29.2 billion, and the revenue at the end of April was projected to be 22.96 billion. So we were looking at a deficit at that time of $6.2 billion. The actual deficit was 5.1. And the reason why the deficit was a little smaller than expected was because expenditure was curtailed significantly. So that is the outturn. It is quite similar to what I had announced about 2 months ago, that we're getting a large, serious hit in the energy sector, whereas the other areas are holding their own. In terms of the debt to GDP ratio, just give me 1 second. The Economic Management Division of the Ministry of Finance have done a calculation for me of debt to GDP, and the debt to GDP ratio at the end of October was 82.5%, and at the end of April, 85.5%. So we just had a 3% increase in our debt to GDP ratio. So we've been very careful, even though we've had to borrow to finance expenditure. We have been very, very careful to try and make sure that our debt to GDP ratio did not go up by the amount expected. In terms of the actual public debt itself, the actual public debt at the end of October, the net public debt, because sometimes people get a little confused whether deliberately or otherwise, and they quote the gross public debt, but you can't do that because you have to net that off against money held in reserve at the central bank to repay debt. Quite often when the government borrows, it puts money aside into an account to repay the debt. So you have to net it off. The net public sector debt at the end of October was $122.2 billion, and the net public sector debt at the end of April, 126.2 billion. So the net public sector debt has increased by $4 billion since October, and the debt to GDP ratio has in fact gone from 82.8 to 85.5 during that period. In terms of foreign reserves, we currently have 8 months of import cover, reserves in the vicinity of $6.8 billion US. And in terms of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, notwithstanding a series of drawdowns to finance the shortfall between revenue and expenditure, the Heritage and Stabilization Fund, as of the end of the first week in June, 4th of June, was $5.67 billion US, which is still more, believe it or not, than it was in September 2015. So despite a series of withdrawals from the Heritage Fund over the last 6 years, the amount of money in the fund is still a little bit more than it was when we started out some 6 years ago. Now, I have quite a lot of documentation with me. So what I'd like to do right now is to open up the floor to questions, but I want to confirm that the Honourable Prime Minister had indicated that we will continue our COVID relief grants for the month of June. That is going to happen. That is being arranged at this time, and we are going to add in construction. I need to get a proper estimate of the number of persons in construction, because that is a very amorphous area, because people work in construction, they work in other areas as well. And therefore it's very difficult to get a handle on exactly how many people work in the construction sector. Using the CSO figures, I'm just seeing about 10,000. However, sorry, 100,000. But no, I have to take that back. I'm very sorry. 10,000 is what the CSO has told me work in construction, not 100,000. But I've heard the Contractors Association, the JCC, etc., talking about 60,000 people working in the construction sector. So as I said, it's an amorphous area. One has to be very careful about how one categorizes a construction worker, but we will try our best to work it out. So I'll now open the floor to questions.
Thank you, Minister. Before we proceed, we just kindly ask our media representatives to identify yourself first. And if you can limit your questions to 2 at a time, so that we will move along and come back to you. All right, so I'll now take our first question. Go ahead, reporter.
Hi, good morning, Minister. Rishi Harinanan from Rhythms Communications Network. Minister, I wanted to see clarification on something you would have said in the House of Representatives as it relates to the loan from China, and you would have mentioned that there were no conditions attached to it. But prior to that, you would have said that part of the agreement was that we take Chinese elements. Just to see clarification on that, isn't that, from my understanding, a condition of the loan agreement? And also, you talk about the relief for members of the public sector, but I also wanted to ask about members of the bar sector, because from what I understand, from the food and beverage sector, that is, the industry was quite hit very hard. For over a year, they would have been shut down. And we understand back in 2020, it was promised that some money would be allocated. I understand, if I recall correctly, about 20 million for the self-employed people. Is that still being considered, and where has that reached?
Mr. Hananan, could you just ask me one question next time? It's very hard to keep track of all. I mean, I've lost track. You asked so many.
All right. Well, the first one would be the loan agreement with China. Sure. In the Parliament, you would have said that there were no conditions. Yeah. The other one would be with the food and beverage sector, to get a sense of what is happening with them, given that they would have been closed for quite a while, in particular bars. If I recall correctly, last year we would have been told that some money would have been allocated to the self-employed individuals. I understand that many of them didn't get anything.
Right. So notwithstanding the fact I asked you to ask me one question, you asked me two. All right, it's not a problem, as you are going to do. With respect to the Chinese loan, my statements were in the context of allegations being made or insinuations being made by persons who are at UWI, where they were insinuating that there were structural adjustment conditionalities associated with the Chinese loan. You see, it was all in the context of a statement that I had made, that we have no intention of accessing funding from the IMF at this point in time, because at the very least, you have to give a statement of intent. And in the Parliament, I in fact read excerpts from letters of intent that were written by the government of Jamaica. And I also had a letter of intent written by the government of the Bahamas. And I just want to go back to the letter of intent from the government of Jamaica. This is May 8, 2020. This was in the early days, because those particular countries in the Caribbean, they got it very hard, and they don't have a heritage and stabilization fund to depend on. So the Prime Minister of Jamaica had written to the Managing Director of the IMF and sought access to emergency financing from the IMF, and had committed to a number of things. But for our country, what is relevant is that Jamaica is committing to a fiscal balance of 3.5% of GDP. And Jamaica is committing to a flexible exchange rate and limiting foreign exchange interventions by their central bank. So those are just some of the things that Jamaica had committed to for access to funding from the IMF. May 8, 2020 is the date of the letter. Now let me explain what these two things mean. If we would post a fiscal surplus of 3.5% of GDP in any fiscal year like 2021, for example, our GDP is now about $150 billion. So if you take 3.5% of $150 billion, you'd get $5 billion. So what this is saying is that you would have to spend $5 billion less than your revenue. Our projected revenue at the beginning of this fiscal was of the order of $40 billion. So if we committed to this, what Jamaica has committed to, we would only be able to spend $35 billion. Our budget expenditure has to be in the range of 50 to 51 billion, somewhere around there. The lowest we've been able to get it down to in 1 year, I think, was about 49. We average out at about 50 billion since the 2016 period. So that if we were to only spend $35 billion and our actual, more or less inescapable mandatory expenditure is $50 billion, then there'd be a shortfall of 15 if we were to do what Jamaica is doing, is saying, look, we're going to post a fiscal surplus. And $15 billion, if you take that out of government expenditure, that's why I extrapolated and say, put that across the board. What does $15 billion do? Our public service salaries are about $2 billion a month. So that's 24 billion a year. Let's round it off at 25. So you'd have to, let's say, if you address that to the public sector, you'd have to reduce public sector expenditure for salaries and wages from 25 billion down to 10, because you're taking out 15 billion. And I mean, I was quite conservative in my estimates. We currently employ about 90,000 people throughout the public sector, in the RHAs, the public service, etc. So if you cut public service expenditure from 25 to 10, that is in fact far more than 30,000 people would have to go home, more like 50,000. But if you took the 15 billion, you spread it around, you say, right, we would take out some from the public sector. We would take out some from subsidies of water and electricity. We would take out some from social services and so on. The devastating effect that would have on Trinidad and Tobago, I don't think we will be able to recover from that as a country. So that is a conditionality. You see, it's not a condition, it's a conditionality. This is a policy statement that Jamaica is making. And then they also said they're going to have a flexible exchange rate with limited foreign exchange interventions by their central bank. So we currently put about $1.8 billion into the system, the central bank, every 2 weeks or so. We put in 100 million US, 75 million US, that sort of thing. And if we were to follow that, there would be no intervention by the central bank into the system. So over $1 billion US would just disappear from the commercial banks because the central bank gives it to the various commercial banks. So if we followed this, the dollar would slide and there would be no foreign exchange available in the commercial banking sector from the government. So the point I made is that even if you're going for emergency financing from the IMF, you have to tell them you're going to do these things. This is, in Jamaica's case, is a letter of intent. You have to say, I intend to do this. And with the Chinese loan, there's nothing like that. All the Chinese said is that because as part of their outreach program, as part of their foreign policy, as part of their development of their own institutions, that they are lending money to Trinidad and Tobago, and therefore 15% of the money that they are lending us must be spent on things called Chinese elements, and that could be anything. That could be equipment, vaccines, medical supplies, it could be anything once it's manufactured in China. So that's part of their export drive. But it is not a conditionality where the government of China is coming and saying, look, send home 20,000 public servants, double the price of electricity, triple the price of water. It's not that. Those are conditionalities. So the point I was making in reference to the statements being made, the insinuations being made, that Chinese loan had conditionalities attached to it, such as retrenchment, is that it was nothing of the sort. It's simply saying, spend 15% on goods manufactured in China. I hope that has cleared that up. With respect to the bars, we are in discussions with them, and we found it very difficult to assist them because of the informality of that sector. But we are committed to help them, and I am in dialogue with the association, and we will do the best that we can for them. I don't want to quantify it at this point in time. What I can tell you in terms of persons who applied for our salary relief grant, 50% of them came from an area called food restaurant services, and I'm sure that would include some bars. We didn't get many applications from bars, just about 1,000 out of 30. And I think that has a lot to do with the informality in that sector, because the salary relief grant is for persons who are listed within the NIS system. They have an NIS number. They don't necessarily have to be up to date with all their payments. You just have to be in the system. And what we found is only 1,000 persons applied out of 30,000 from bars, whereas 15,000 applied from the food restaurant sector and 13,500 applied from the retail sector. So there is a problem with bars in terms of the informality, people not being registered for tax, not being registered for NIS, and so on. And we have to keep working with them to see how we can help them, because we can't just give away money without any sort of registration process. We must understand what we are doing. So that is the answer to those two questions.
Hi, Bina.
Yes. Bina, here's ITV News. Are you all hearing me?
Yes.
Okay, good morning, Minister. Good morning to the everyone else present. I have two short questions. Minister, first, if someone could not make the deadline, the June 11th deadline for May's salary relief grant, are they allowed to apply for both May and June at this point in time? And
let me answer it.
Sure,
once they are qualified, we would allow that.
Okay, so they can apply for both once they are qualified. All right, thank you. And my second question, it has to do with the loan from China. This is probably a part two to the first question. What is China's rate of interest for the loan, for the $204 million loan, compared to what we would have possibly paid to the IMF? Thank you.
Chinese loan is a very attractive interest rate of 2%. The IMF is 1.05%. So there isn't much to choose between them. And therefore, if one has to make a judgment call, you're getting a loan at 2% and you're getting a loan at 1%. One loan, no structural adjustment. You don't have to retrench people. You don't have to devalue your currency, et cetera, et cetera. That's one loan at 2%. And then another loan, 1%, you have to do all kind of terrible things and punish your population. That's a no-brainer. Obviously, you go with the one that doesn't have any structural adjustment conditionalities associated with it, especially since the interest rates are very, very close, just 1% apart.
Hi, Nadaline. Right.
Hi. Good day, everybody. Nadaline Singh, Caribbean Lifestyle Communications. I was just wondering, we're talking about the construction grants, so grants for workers within the construction sector. I was just wondering, given the fact that we are in such high debt, where are we going to get the funds to fund these grants? Do I put my second question one time, or is Minister going to go with this one?
Answer that right away. That is a decision that this government has faced since this pandemic began. What do you do? Do you say we should not withdraw from the Heritage Fund, we should not borrow, and therefore we shouldn't help anybody? That is option A. Don't help anybody because we have fairly high debt to GDP ratio. Option B is do what you can, try and manage your debt service as best as you can, and try your best to help as many people as you can. We're going with option B. All the countries in the world, if you look all over the world, the UK's debt to GDP ratio crossed 100% in 2020. They took a conscious decision to borrow hundreds of billions of pounds. Conscious decision to do that. The US took a conscious decision to access $4 trillion. Every country in the world has done it. And it is recognized that it is necessary to maintain economic momentum and to try and help the most vulnerable. So whether or not our debt to GDP ratio is in the 80% range, we are going to continue to help people. And that's the point the Prime Minister made over the weekend when he said we would add in construction. We will see where we can find the money, but we will find it. We think it's more important to try and assist as many people as we can and maintain economic momentum rather than deal with these theoretical, limits and metrics. They're all theoretical. The European Union for years had a maximum debt to GDP ratio among its member countries of 65%. It was actually within EU law that was the limit. They changed that law last year. The European Union made a decision that countries could go above 65% debt to GDP because they recognized they had to assist their populations to make it through this pandemic and assist their businesses and so on.
And my second question is, Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar had pointed to the fact that the $3 billion mid-year review budget is passing through the Parliament, but permission wasn't granted by the Parliament to have such a large, sizable package. And she thought that, okay, the government should have asked permission of the Parliament to spend the $3 billion first before it come with the mid-year review package. I was just wondering what was the rationale for this, and perhaps you can give us some explanation on that.
Nothing's wrong with your question. Once you started out with a statement made by Mrs. Prasad-Bissessar that you start off wrong there one time. And secondly, the whole point of the debate in the Parliament last week was to seek permission to spend the $3 billion. I can't understand this question that you asked me. Are you simply repeating what the leader of the opposition said? Because if she actually said that, and I don't know if she did, but if she did, that's absolute nonsense. The whole point of the debate last week was to go to Parliament and seek parliamentary approval, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, to increase expenditure by $2.9 billion and seek the approval of both houses. So I really don't understand.
Hi, good morning. Priya Bihari, azpnews.com. Minister Imbert, I want to take you back to the last press conference you had on May 10th when you spoke about the loan from China. You did say, and I don't want to quote you correctly, you said you think that the Ministry of Health had put in an order for 1.5 of the Sinopharm vaccines. I think the Minister of Health has subsequently said, I think, we're going to get about 500,000 of those vaccines. Can you give us an idea now how many of the Sinopharm vaccines we are going to purchase and what would be the cost? And also in terms of the Chinese element, what would we use the loan other Chinese to purchase other Chinese elements? If you have an idea what these are.
Them cut it off, not me.
Oh.
I didn't touch it.
You have some audio in the background there. I don't know what the problem is.
Not me.
Somebody else is somebody's talking or something.
That's background.
That's your background, sir. My IT department has detected that. Let's not argue about that. So I saw a video circulating, created by the opposition, which juxtaposed the statements made by the Minister of Health in the Parliament in response to a question about Sinopharm vaccines just this week. And it juxtaposed statements I made at the press conference a month ago. Now, this press conference today is about what I'm talking about today. I don't mind going back to this issue because it's a topical issue. When I saw the video that was constructed obviously by some opposition person, and the whole point of the video was to show what I said and what the Minister of Health said, and try and prove that the Minister of Health was not speaking the truth. There was something odd about it. I didn't hear in the clip myself saying that the Minister of Health had ordered 1.5 million Sinopharm vaccines. The word Sinopharm was missing. So I said, all right. I went and I got the tape of my press conference in May the 9th or 10th, I think it was. And surprise, surprise, what I was saying in that press conference was that the government was looking at a series of sources of vaccines. You were looking at Pfizer vaccines, you're looking at AstraZeneca vaccines, you're looking at Sinopharm vaccines, and that the total amount of vaccines that were being ordered by the Ministry of Health at that time was in the range of $1.5 billion. And then I gave different prices. I said, AstraZeneca is coming in below $5. Pfizer was looking at $23 and Sinopharm was 15, and we were trying to get that price down. So whoever did that video was very clever and very mischievous. What they did was take my statement about vaccines globally and pretend that I had said that the Minister of Health was ordering 1.5 million Sinopharm vaccines. I said no such thing. I said that was the total amount of all vaccines from all sources at that point in time. What I can tell you now is that the Ministry of Finance, on behalf of the Ministry of Health, has paid in full for the delivery of 500,000 Sinopharm vaccines in 2 batches so far. The first batch was 200,000, which arrived yesterday. And the second batch that we have paid for is supposed to be 300,000, which will come within a couple of weeks or so, I am told. But I'm not into the vaccine delivery side of things. I am into the payment. So my responsibility is to make sure we have money. So even though we had not yet drawn down on the Chinese loan, and we haven't done that yet. We haven't accessed those funds yet. We went ahead because this is so important, and we paid in full for 500,000 Sinopharm vaccines. So those are your facts. And just to tidy up that, the government received a donation of 100,000 Sinopharm vaccines previously. So the total amount of Sinopharm in the system at this point in time will be 600,000. Already 100 plus 200 received, and another 300 to be received shortly. I can't tell you the price because the government has signed a non-disclosure agreement with the government of China, but I can tell you the quantity, which I've just told you, okay? So I hope that clears that up, Brian.
Thank you, Minister. And Minister, while I have you, NATO has declared China as a security threat. As the Minister of Finance of our country, are you concerned about that? I mean, do you continue to treat with China in the same way in terms of loans, etc. now?
Yes, because we as a country have a very long-standing relationship with China. I think it's one of the first countries that Dr. Eric Williams visited when he first became Prime Minister. He went on a visit to China, and we've established diplomatic relations with China now for, I can't tell you how long that is, 50 years, 60 years, is some long time. And we have a long-standing relationship with the government of China. I don't concern myself with those things. That is a matter for the Minister of Foreign Affairs. I would take my instructions from the Prime Minister, and I would be guided by the Minister of Foreign Affairs in terms of which countries we should be doing business with. At this point in time, we enjoy very good diplomatic relations with China, and therefore I have no difficulty whatsoever in doing my job, which is to pay for the Sinopharm vaccines.
Clint?
Hi, morning, Minister. Clint Chantak of Newsday here. Couple of questions I have. Firstly, given all of the COVID-19 financial measures which are currently in place, what kind of safeguards do we have to ensure transparency and prevent anybody from double dipping, as it were, into any of these measures, possibly people accessing measures, things which they either shouldn't or maybe getting more than they should? And the other thing I wanted to ask you about was, have you received any type of clarity from the THA regarding some expenditure between the October 2019 and September 2020 period, some food hampers and COVID-19 food cards, which appeared in the recent Auditor General's report?
What I can say is that we at Finance, we have very robust, very strict systems in place to identify persons who are trying to commit fraud and double dip and so on. And with our latest online digital portal, even more safety features have been built into that. So it's very, very difficult for persons to cheat in terms of our salary relief grant. What I can say is that I had some very encouraging news from the Ministry of Social Development, where they're also improving their detection mechanisms for persons who will be wanting to cheat. Somebody would come to social development, apply for an income support grant, pretend they don't have an NIS number, pretend they didn't get a salary relief grant from the Ministry of Finance. And some of those slipped through the cracks this year. I'm very encouraged by what I'm hearing from the Ministry of Social Development in 2021. Sorry, some of them slipped through the cracks last year. Let me correct that. But this year, what I'm hearing is that they're doing much better. And in fact, the total number of valid applications that they received for the month of May was 4,800 more or less. A little smaller than we anticipated because of the controls that are in place. But we're going to continue to look at it. We have collaboration, we have communication between the two ministries so that we will provide them with the list of persons that we are going to give grants to. They will provide us with the list that they are going to give grants to. We double check if the same person pops up the same name, the same ID card number, the same address, and so on, that person automatically canceled out. So I think we're doing much better in terms of fraudulent behavior, detecting it and dealing with it. With respect to Tobago, I have seen the commentary about the Auditor General's report, and I understand that the Chief Secretary has issued a statement, I saw it last night, dealing in detail with each one of the comments made by the Auditor General with respect to the delivery of COVID relief in Tobago. So what I would suggest is that you contact the Chief Secretary, because he's given a very, very detailed statement on each item: hampers, food cards, the question of identification, the question of whether a person should be asked to sign for hampers, what systems they have in place to prevent double dipping and fraud. So I suggest you take that directly to him, but he has made a very detailed statement addressing each one of the points made by the Auditor General. Okay.
Hi, Joel.
Joel Brown, TV6 News. Good morning, Minister. Good morning, everyone. Two things. One, I know you had discussed just a short while ago the issue of non-disclosure agreements with regard to the acquisition of the vaccines. So I'm just wondering, do you have any sort of an estimate in terms of how much the government is expected to spend in fiscal 2021 and possibly fiscal 2022 in terms of the number of vaccines? We're not asking about the number in terms of the cost in acquiring vaccines for this financial year and the government's next financial year. And my second question, I could pose after you answer the first.
I'm very glad you asked that. I mean, I've answered that 3 times already, but no problem. That was to politicians. Let me answer it to you. We have already spent $10.3 million US, and that is on the COVAX facility. So there was an initial payment of about $1.5 million US last year, 2020. To get involved in COVAX, you had to put this money forward as a kind of a deposit that went towards research and development of the vaccines. So all the countries in the COVAX alliance were asked to contribute a certain amount of money to assist in the rapid research and development of vaccines. So we put out $1.5 million US for that. Then we purchased just over 100,000 AstraZeneca vaccines from COVAX in 3 tranches. And we've also paid for 500,000 Sinopharm vaccines in full. And we've made a down payment for, initially it was 600,000 doses of the Johnson & Johnson single shot vaccine. And then we were upgraded to 800,000 doses of the Johnson & Johnson single shot vaccine, which is coming from the Africa Vaccination Acquisition Trust. AVAT is the acronym. When you take that all together, if you take 800,000 2-shot vaccines, which would be the Sinopharm and the AstraZeneca, if you add them all together, it's about 200,000 AstraZeneca in all. If you add up all the various deliveries of AstraZeneca, quite a lot of it in donation. So it's about 100,000 paid for and about 100,000 donated from various sources. Yeah, we got 40,000 from India, and then we got quite a lot from the Caribbean as well. So 200,000 AstraZeneca, 600,000 Sinopharm, which is 100,000 donated, 500,000 paid for. So that's 800,000 2-shot, 2-dose vaccines. That vaccinates 400,000 people, okay? And then the 800,000 single-shot Johnson & Johnson is 800,000 people. So you take the 400,000 people who will be vaccinated with the 2-dose, and you take the 800,000 who will be vaccinated with the single dose, you get 1.2 million people. And those are real numbers. So that we spent so far $10.3 million US, about 70 million TT dollars. The balance to be paid for the AVAT vaccines is $5.4 million US, 37 million TT dollars. So if you take the TT 70 million spent already on vaccines and the 37 million we still have to spend, you will get a total of 107 million TT dollars. That's all supposed to be spent in this fiscal year, because we expect to get, so far, I mean, look at what happened to COVAX, where COVAX was supposed to start delivering in February and March and so on, and they couldn't deliver the full amount that they had said they would. They couldn't deliver the 100,000 in one go. It came in drips of 30, 33,000 and so on. But if everything goes according to plan, then the African vaccines will start to come in August, and we would start to make the final payments for them. So it looks as if that in this fiscal year, if everything goes according to plan, we will spend 107 million TT dollars in total. And for that, we will receive sufficient vaccines, 1.6 million vaccines, but 800 is 2 dose and 800,000 is single dose to vaccinate 1.2 million people. So those are facts. And I've already said this in the parliament, but I'm glad you brought it up so I could give you these precise numbers.
Also just wondering, Minister, in terms of fiscal 2022, have you already begun to calculate what expenditure may be allotted out of the budget for that financial year for the acquisition of vaccines, and where the money in total, how are you financing these budgetary allocations?
Okay, now the 107 million for all the vaccines, we expect to spend it in this fiscal year, but you know, things can slip. So there would be a slip over into 2021 if there's a problem. But it wouldn't be significant because, as I said, we've already spent 70 million. And I would think even if there's a problem, we would still be spending maybe 80, 90 million this year. And therefore just looking at about 20 million, 30 million next year. Where we financed it from? Well, we got a lot of assistance from international bodies, from the Andean Development Bank, from CAF, from the IDB, from domestic borrowing and so on, from the Heritage Fund. So we have already raised this money. We already have this money, we've already paid it. With respect to Sinopharm vaccines, if we buy more, if it is not necessary, perhaps by that time the Chinese loan would be ready for disbursement, so we could use it for that. If not, we would simply use the existing funding available to us, which, as I said, we've raised through borrowing from international sources, local sources, and the Heritage Fund. And we will pay for them, and then we'll have to look at other Chinese elements. And Chinese elements could be anything made in China. Equipment, PPE, vehicles, anything. It's just part of their export drive. So that I'm sure there are many things that in Trinidad and Tobago that we can use, many, many, many things, where we could use that money. It's 15% of 200 million, so you're looking at about 30 million or so is US, about 200 million TT, and I'm sure that there are many things we could use it to construct buildings for projects. It just has to be of Chinese origin. So that in terms of going into 2022, we'll look and see whether we need to offer more humanitarian relief. We'll have to see how it goes. The pandemic is a moving target. You don't know what's going on. I'm sure you didn't think, and I could tell you, I didn't think that in June of 2021, we're still talking about lockdowns. And I mean, yesterday on the news, I was shocked. I saw Malaysia has gone into an emergency lockdown because they've had a spike, came out of nowhere. They can't trace it. That's what I found interesting about the Malaysia problem, looking at news out of Kuala Lumpur, where they just have a spike in cases that they can't trace it. They don't even know where it came from. So they locked down. They've closed everything except essential businesses. This is in June of 2021. So as I said, I had no idea in June of 2021 we will still be in this situation. I'm really hoping that before the end of this calendar year, we come out of this, but then you never know. So that the need for humanitarian relief will continue and will be done on an as-needed basis. So if we see in fiscal 2022, we have to give relief, we will find the money and give relief. Because as I said, we're committed to that. Committed to two things: giving as much support and relief as we can, possibly, and also keeping the economic momentum.
Prior.
Minister, you just answered my question. You know, I wanted to know if there was, you know, specific items that we are going to use with the Chinese.
No, just made in China, that's all.
So let me ask another question in terms of regularization of the gas station industry. How is that going? You have any update?
I'm glad you brought that up. Let me stop you now. Let me stop you. I'm going to the Parliament on the 2nd of July to do legislation that would be called the Finance Bill 2021. And the primary purpose of that finance bill is to liberalize the retail fuel industry. So that will present the new formula for the pricing of motor fuels. That debate will take place on the 2nd of July. In that finance bill, I'll have a few other things that we said that we would do in the budget, such as increasing the fines for predial larceny and things like that. And also at the same time, there's some incentives for construction in terms of tax waivers for approved development projects that will also be implemented at the same time. So now that I've told you that prior, you could go ahead.
Do we have time for more?
Yeah, I'm good.
Hi, good afternoon, Minister. I wanted to find out if you could give us an idea on what is happening with the yachting sector, given that they themselves would have been closed for quite a while. They also want some kind of assistance. And of course, many sectors will come out and say that they want assistance, but is it something that we can consider at this time?
I hope so. Speaking personally as someone who has some association with that sector, I hope so. What the problem was, the whole question of transmission of the virus, especially the variants. But I'm really hoping that as we start to ease up and as we move towards new systems with vaccination, you know, some countries in the world now, they're allowing you to travel once you can prove you're fully vaccinated and you have a negative PCR test. You can come in and you shorten the quarantine period or no quarantine at all. Some countries are like that. I'm hoping that as we move towards that we would be able to open up the yachting sector. I really feel for them. I've been trying, but I mean, I'm only one and I have to follow the doctrine of collective responsibility, but I know they're hurting and I'm really hoping that at some point in time in the near future, we can assist that sector.
Hi again. I was just wondering, since we've seen many businesses closing down and we've seen some people being affected across many sectors, I was just wondering if the ministry has seen an uptake in mergers and acquisitions since we went into all the different COVID-19 measures. And while you're at it, I was just wondering if the ministry has also established, like, what is the state of the economy now? And going forward is what sort of ray of hope do you put for the business community and for other entrepreneurs within the country? Thank you.
I had given some projections in terms of GDP. The technocrats in the ministry have done a projection for me, and what they are projecting so far is that we have come down from a significant economic contraction in 2020, fiscal 2020, like the rest of the world, of about 8 or 9%. We follow the world. The global average for economic contraction in fiscal 2020 was 11%. Our fiscal contraction is somewhere between 8 and 9%. So we follow the world a little bit, global average. The IMF is projecting in its latest fiscal monitor, it is projecting that in fiscal 2021, that the global contraction in the economy will be 9%. So it is minus 11 in 2020, and they're projecting minus 9 in 2021. And going down after that to minus 6 and minus 5 and minus 4. But it looks like the world will be in a little bit of trouble for some time based on what I'm seeing in terms of IMF projections for global GDP. But we have been very fortunate so far based on the information I have received so far, and I have to depend on what my technocrats tell me. I'm not going to second guess them and do the maths myself. We have brilliant economists in the Ministry of Finance. They're looking at this all the time, and they are telling me that what they're seeing for 2021 is a contraction of just 1%. So we've dropped from 8% minus down to just minus 1%. So the economy has certainly stabilized. And if you look at the figures I gave at the beginning of this press conference in terms of the revenue from the non-oil sector, it's holding its own, and the revenue taxation on individuals is almost what it should be. So that I think, like many countries in the world, we will be able to recover in fiscal 2022, and we will be able to grow our economy again based on the data that I am seeing at this point in time. You had asked me another question, Madeline. So could you just refresh my memory on what that second question was?
Allow me to unmute her, Minister.
Have you seen an uptick in mergers and acquisitions?
What the question? The only merger I saw was a merger of two pharmaceutical companies. Agostini bought Oscar Francois and Moji2. That's the only thing I have seen. I haven't seen anything else. So the answer is very limited information and activity in that area.
Yes, Minister, just wondering, with regard to your announcement concerning legislation for what essentially would be the establishment of what could be called more of a floating price arrangement.
It would move, that's true.
What about that in the context of the present economic situation right now, where, for example, you have so many who are out of work or maybe working with reduced salaries, the potential impact, if any, of such an arrangement on the issue of inflation and so on, is that something that the government is looking at in light of the financial difficulties so many people are experiencing? And the net-on effect this could have on, say, the cost of transportation, public transportation, as well as the transportation of goods and services, and potential price increases thereafter. That's my first question.
Now, one of the reasons why we've been able to maintain our investment grade rating, and it was a serious challenge last year, and we actually going into the rating season within the next month or so, we'll be meeting with Moody's and Standard & Poor's. And in fact, we have meetings with the IMF as well. One of the reasons why we've been able to maintain an investment grade rating, even in the midst of all this chaos, is that the government has been doing its own adjustment. So that when we came in 2015, the annual expenditure was in excess of $60 billion a year. We have that down now to 50. So we cut annual expenditure by, say, 20%. But we have work to do, because we have to look at the money that is spent by way of subsidies on the supply of water, the supply of electricity, and the supply of fuel. Because even though what some of the local economists say is outrageous and ridiculous, when they tell us that we should only spend $35 billion and it doesn't matter what happens, 50,000 people could get retrenched, no big thing. That's the kind of foolishness that comes out of our university. Punish people, suffer them, don't worry, balance the budget. Even though those recommendations are ridiculous, we as a government have to keep looking at the deficit between revenue and expenditure, because you can't go on forever spending significantly more than you earn. So that we have to look at things like subsidies on fuel, water, and electricity, and we have to deal with it. Because last year we had a deficit of 16 billion. This year, I'm not sure what it will be, but it will be more than $10 billion. And that has to be borrowed, or you withdraw from the Heritage Fund. You can't keep doing that forever. That would be totally irresponsible. So unfortunately, we have to deal with these issues that have been left unattended for so long. The last time I think we had adjustment in water rates was maybe 10 or 15 years ago. It could be even longer. Electricity rates, I can't remember when that was. And the Minister of Public Utilities made the point in the Parliament during the debate on the supplementation of appropriation that our water rates are 1/5 of the water rates in other islands in the Caribbean, like Jamaica and so on. So that we as a country have to tackle these things. Right now we subsidize water to the tune of $2 billion a year. That can't continue. We used to subsidize Petrotrin to the tune of $2 billion a year, but that couldn't continue. And now the restructured Petrotrin is making $1 billion a year in profit. So it's gone from a loss of $2 billion to a profit of $1 billion. That's what came out of that restructuring of Petrotrin and that decision to stop taking $2 billion of taxpayers' money and spending it there. And we have to look at the other areas of inefficiency in the country. And as I said, we have to do it. Otherwise, if we say, all right, let's not do it. So let's continue to subsidize fuel. Let's continue to subsidize water. Let's continue to subsidize electricity. What's going to happen? At some point in time, the money will run out. And then we will find ourselves in this bad place that these economists keep telling me I must go to the IMF. So that we have decided as a government to do our own policy adjustments and do things that are reasonable. And I think this is something that is long overdue. It's reasonable. Of course, there will be some costs, but it's better than having to go cap in hand to the IMF and retrench 25,000 people. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Good morning again, Minister. I finally get to ask my question. In terms of the gas station industry again, there's a concern that the smaller people who operate the gas station now may not be able to have the financial wherewithal to purchase that gas station when the system is open up. And maybe there'll be a lot of big business that would own these gas stations. Are you putting anything to help support the smaller business owners who may want to purchase a gas station?
Well, if you look at the record of this government, there's a lot of propaganda outside there. I spoke about a bit of propaganda recently in this press conference, where they make up that video about the 1.5 million Sinopharm vaccines, but there's a lot of other propaganda outside. Look at what we did with the National Investment Fund. There was an old talk that we were just going to give away Republic Bank shares and all the other assets we recovered from Clivo, give it away to the 1%. We didn't. We created the National Investment Fund and we invited everybody, John public from the lowest to the largest, to invest. And as a result, 7,000 people invested in NIF bonds. That is not what we as a government are going to do. I could talk, I don't know what's going on with some other government, but this government will make sure that everything is done fairly, equitably, and we will assist those little people that you're talking about to make sure that some conglomerate doesn't come along or some hidden invisible group comes along and snatches up those gas stations. That is not going to happen. And I will give you that assurance this morning.
Priya, did you have another question?
That's it. Is there anybody else?
Yeah, we have another question from Jules Brown.
Sure.
Yes, Minister, just warning, in terms of the issue of the border controls, I know that the government, the Prime Minister had said that they would be revisiting this with the expectation maybe within a certain period of time, sooner rather than later, there would be no longer the exemption policy and whatnot. I'm wondering in the context of Caribbean Airlines, state-owned airline, I know I had posed a question recently about the airline, but in terms of this new development, the staffing, for example, I don't know how many, let's say, pilots or flight attendants or other staff maybe have furloughed and so on. Would you anticipate that all of the staff would be back to work, or would it be on a phased basis? And what assistance has been given to the staff there at Caribbean Airlines during this period when they were not flying in the air?
Okay. The government subsidized Caribbean Airlines to the tune of $100 million US last year, 700 million Trinidad and Tobago dollars. And that is in addition to the government taking responsibility for a number of loans that Caribbean Airlines has on its books, which it simply cannot pay. So the government is already committed to significant debt servicing on behalf of Caribbean Airlines, which is in addition to the $700 million bailout we gave them in 2020. We can't bail them out to the tune of $700 million in 2021 unless the airline gets itself ready and makes itself as efficient as possible for resumption of flights. I would expect flights would resume on a phased basis. We don't know what's going on in the world. Yes, some airlines are flying, it is true. But I would expect Caribbean Airlines would ramp up, start small and then get bigger and bigger in terms of flying as soon as the public health regulations are sorted out. That I like to stay in my section. I don't deal with public health regulations. That is Prime Minister, Minister of Health, etc. They handle that. But as soon as Caribbean Airlines gets the signal that there's a policy by which flights can resume, then I expect Caribbean Airlines to resume. But I expect them to resume in the most efficient shape and form that is available based on expert advice. I know they have been getting expert advice from aviation consultants in terms of what the airline should look like, how many planes it should have, what routes it should fly, and that sort of thing. I know they've spent their time over the last 6 months doing this. Very careful, very deliberate work in terms of expert advice. And I assume as soon as the public health matters are resolved and whatever system is put in place to allow the resumption of flights, that Caribbean Airlines will make a presentation to the wider public, the media, etc., and let everybody know what the restructured Caribbean Airlines would look like, because we can't spend another $700 million of taxpayers' money on CAL in 2021 unless we can see light at the end of the tunnel. We can see them returning to profitability and so on. They did very, very well a couple of years ago where they made an operating profit of over $100 million in 1 year. COVID just came and destroyed all of that. So that I am expecting CAL to show a plan for return to at minimum a break-even position and then towards profitability. And it will be a restructured airline, but I will leave that up to Caribbean Airlines to talk about. And I would not expect them to say a word until the public health matters are resolved, whether persons will still have to get exemptions, or if you're fully vaccinated and you have negative tests, you can just come in without exemptions. We are waiting on that. And as soon as we get that signal, then I expect Caribbean Airlines to talk about its future. But I wouldn't want to talk out of turn at this point in time.
We have no questions.
Good. That's it?
Yeah. So
all right. Well, again, I want to thank everybody. And you've given me the opportunity to clear up a lot of things that were out there in the public domain. And I will look forward to many more of these sessions with the media. Thank you very much for your cooperation.
Thank you, members of the media and the viewing public, for joining us. Please stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day.